Okay, our last lecture here on the age of nationalism and sectionalism has to do with the strengthening of the national government within our courts. And so this is going to span a time period from the Adams administration well up into the Jefferson and even Madison administrations. And so understanding the court of John Marshall, okay, which affectionately becomes known as Marshall Court. So understanding some of the rulings of Chief Justice John Marshall, he was one of John Adams' midnight judges, so part of the Judiciary Act of 1801 that increased the number of federal judges and allowed Adams to start to handpick some Federalists to try to keep that checks and balance to the now becoming the Democratic and Republican executive branch with Jefferson taking power. And so Chief Justice John Marshall comes in and he is a staunch Federalist, okay, for the Supreme Court. And so he's going to serve on the court for more than 30 years, and he's going to hand down decisions that would strengthen the power of the Supreme Court itself, but also that of the federal government. So this is why it falls under the era of nationalism, because he is solidifying that the national government has more power than that of the state governments. And so kind of going with the idea of putting the greater interest of the country as a whole above regional or sectional ties that would include state powers. So one of the first cases that John Marshall ruled in was in Marbury versus Madison, which took place in 1803. William Marbury was one of the midnight judges who had not received his official papers. And according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, it required that the Secretary of State to deliver those papers. And at this time, this happened to be James Madison under Jefferson's administration. Well, Jefferson told Madison not to deliver those papers. And so Marbury saw this as a violation of federal law and so sued on those provisions. Chief Justice Marshall kind of read through the case, looked at the situation, and he actually ruled in favor of Jefferson and Madison, which was quite a shock, being a Federalist judge at the time. But it is going to set a great precedence. He felt that the Judiciary Act of 1801 that was established by, I'm sorry, not 1801, of 1789 that was established by Washington did not have the constitutional right to give those powers to the Supreme Court to force those appointments to be given. And so while this ruled in favor of Jefferson and Madison at the time, it does establish the principal idea of judicial review, which gives the Supreme Court the ability to name any laws, whether they're congressional laws or state laws, unconstitutional. And so the power of judicial review is one of the main powers of the Supreme Court today. The next court case that John Marshall is going to hear is that of Gibbons versus Ogden. So at the time, this is going to be dealing with interstate trade. In the New York legislature, they had given exclusive rights to certain steamboat companies to be able to conduct trade within New York. And one such person to get this was Aaron Ogden. He had been given under New York state law the ability to run his steamship line between New York and New Jersey. So he believed he was the only operator legally to do this, that he had a monopoly on the trade. Well, then comes along Thomas Gibbons, who began to run a similar service in the same area. But he was claiming that he was entitled to do this according to federal law to be able to conduct interstate trade. So Ogden took Gibbons to court to try to stop him. But in 1824, under the ruling of John Marshall, they ruled that interstate commerce could be regulated only by the federal government. So in other words, Ogden's exclusive right granted by New York was no longer valid. It was not legal. And so this was an important ruling because, again, this gave the national government the power to overturn a state law or state action. And so interstate commerce could only be regulated by the federal government. And only the federal government could interfere on things that cross state lines. Okay, states have no say in those matters. So states have the ability to control anything within their borders according to reserve rights. But the instant that any manufacturing or any items cross state lines, it becomes a national issue or national regulation. So that's why today, like airline industries or even wireless internet or cell phone service or television is nationally regulated, not state by state. Another major court case that is also going to come up during Marshall's reign in the Supreme Court is going to be Mcculloch versus Maryland. And this is going to take place in 1819. And this is where, again, Chief Justice John Marshall is going to strengthen the federal government's control. In this case, this is going to deal with the economy. So Maryland had levied a heavy tax on a local branch of the Bank of the United States. So Maryland did not like the National Bank at the time, and so hoping to make the National Bank fail. However, Marshall declared that if this were allowed, states would be in effect overturning laws passed by Congress. So the Chief Justice denied the right of Maryland to tax the National Bank, stating that the power to tax is the power to destroy. So he declared the Bank of the United States to be constitutional in that act. So we're going to see that become an important factor later on because of the fact that we're going to see another President Andrew Jackson, try to take on the National Bank. Okay, so here states do not have the right to tax a federal institution. So in this case being the National Bank. The last court case that we're going to take a look at is Fletcher versus Peck, which took place in 1810. The Supreme Court at this time has started to make several rulings that block state interference when it came to business and commerce. And so in Fletcher versus Peck, for example, states could not interfere in an individual's right to enter contracts. And so this is where in the state of Georgia, a Georgia law had violated an individual's constitutional right to enter into a contract within the state of Georgia. And so this is where the Supreme Court overruled that law in Georgia, saying they could not do that. So overall, Marshall Court is going to be created to build a stronger sense of the Supreme Court. Some of his court decisions are going to define, even today, some of the abilities of the Supreme Court. And overall, was trying to promote a sense of nationalism, of putting the national government ahead of the state governments.